So Hanna Brink, she is currently a postdoc with her own funding in EAWAG and also associated with University of Bern. Before that, she did her first postdoc in Zurich, in Hanna Coco's group. That's where we meet each other and get to know each other. I was also a postdoc at the time. And before that, she finished her PhD in Amsterdam in the Institute of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Dynamics. And today, Hanna is going to talk to us about evolutionary models and about speciation and biodiversity. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shani. Yeah, so in my work, I'm interested in the ecological and evolutionary consequences of individual causes and consequences, actually, of individual development. And today I will talk about adaptive radiation and how that is affected by individual developments. With an adaptive radiation, what that means is that a lineage diversifies into multiple species, exploiting a variety of niches. And these adaptive radiations are responsible for much of the diversity of life. And therefore, if we want to explain the origins of biodiversity, it's really important to understand why some lineages undergo adaptive radiations, whereas others do not. And a textbook example of an adaptive radiations are the cichlids in African lakes. In multiple lakes, these cichlids have radiated really quickly and into multiple species. And in the early history of this adaptive radiation, these species all started to occupy different ecological niches where different guilds arose, each specialized in feeding on a different resource. And these feeding specializations are, you can actually see that clearly in the morphology of these species. So I show you on the left a piscivore and on the right algae grazer. So the algae grazer grazes algae from rocks. And you can see that the mouth morphology is extremely different. So the piscivore has really sharp teeth and looks like a predator, while the algae grazer has very dense, many rows of teeth that are very dense, and also the whole jaw is adapted to actually scrape those algae from rocks. But despite these super highly diverse adult feeding specializations, nearly all baby fish, all the fry, are planktivores, so they feed upon planktivore. And morphologically, it's very difficult to actually tell which species is which at this early life stages. They all look the same, and unless you actually look at the DNA, it's very difficult, even by a specialist, to tell them apart. They don't know, they all look very similar because they all feed upon planktivore. And also here in Switzerland, we have the radiation of the whitefish, where in several lakes we have multiple morphs of whitefish. And also here, the adult form is highly specialized. So you have zooplanktivores and bentivores, and they look very similar, very different. But also here, again, the larvae look very similar. And also here, we cannot tell at this stage which belongs to which species, except if you kill them and take the DNA out. However, most theoretical models that we have that looks at the conditions for speciation and adaptive radiation is based on unstructured models, where individuals, after they are born, immediately actually have very similar morphologies as the parent when at the moment they become independent of the parent. So in these models, individuals are born and they can immediately reproduce, and they do exactly the same as what older individuals do. And these kind of models might work quite well for mammals and birds, because mammals and birds, as soon as they become independent from the parents, they have more or less the same size of the parents and more or less the same ecology. However, for the majority of animal species, this is just not really true, because the majority of all animal species have a metamorphosis, where there's really an abrupt transition in the morphology, the habitat, the diet used during the life cycle of an individual. And of course, you're all familiar with the classical examples like the butterflies and the frogs that have really this abrupt metamorphosis, but also in marine invertebrates like corals, no, not corals, sea stars, etc. Metamorphosis is common. And in addition to these species with an abrupt metamorphosis, there are also many species that have more gradual changes in their lifetime, which is, for example, the case in many fish that start as very small and later in life, they gradually change their habitat and their diet. So what I want to know is how does these changes in ecology over the lifetime of an individual affects the conditions for adaptive radiation? And to do so, I make use of size-structured population models. And I assume, well, not I assume, in these models, individual growth and reproduction is not a fixed property, but it depends on food intake. So individuals that have lots of food available, they can grow much faster compared to individuals that have less food available. And in addition, I assume that small individuals can only feed upon a shared resource, for example, small zooplankton, while the large individuals, they have access to a total of 6 available resources. And these, so there's lots of ecological opportunity, which is a necessary condition for adaptive radiation. But these different resources each require different morphology to be effectively utilized, which is also what we know from, for example, what I showed you in the cichlids. The Piscivore has a different morphology than the algae grazer. And I will now explain to you how I incorporated those trade-offs. First of all, attack rate on a certain resource increases with body mass. And this reflects the fact that larger individuals, they can search a larger volume per time unit. So the attack rate on resource 1 in yellow increases with body mass. The individual that I show you here is specialized on this resource. And therefore, the attack rate on resource 2 is much lower. It also increases with body mass, but it's much lower. And its attack rate on resource 3 and also the other resources that are available is close to 0. This is a specialist on resource 1 and a specialist on resource 2, I show you on the right, has a very high attack rate on the second resource, but much lower on the first and the third, and it's almost 0 for the fourth resource. So there are trade-offs. You cannot be specialized on all resources together. And the way these trade-off is depends on one ecological trait, the feeding niche trait value. So here I plot you the trait of the individual and the factor by which the attack rates are scaled. And the yellow indicates how the scaling factor depends on this trait of the individual for resource 1. And if your trait value is close to theta 1, you have the maximum scaling factor, and all values that are slightly lower or higher, the scaling factor decreases in a normal and Gaussian distributed way. And for resource 2, the curve is shifted slightly to the right. So therefore, you need a slightly higher trait value to be able to really to feed upon this resource. And for all other resources, the curves are slightly shifted to the right. And because I'm interested in the conditions for adaptive radiation and want to study how that is different in the present and in the absence of these life history, this individual development, I parameterize the curves in such a way that in the absence of diet shifts and development, an adaptive radiation will unfold. Because if these curves are super far apart from each other, you don't get an adaptive radiation and individuals will just specialize on a single resource. Well, if these curves are super close to each other, evolution will result in a generalist species. But if they are have the right distance and the right width, you get an adaptive radiation in the case of no individual development. And then I assume two different life histories. The first is that I assume that there's not really a developmental trade-off. So what I plot here is the scaling factor of the shared resource with the dashed line as a function of the feeding niche trait value. And it's if there's no developmental trade-off, it's a horizontal line, which means that independent of what you do as an adult, you are equally good in feeding on the shared resource early in life. So independent of the specialization of what you do later on, you are really good in feeding upon the zooplankton. And this kind of life history would, for example, be true for species that have a metamorphosis. So they can really change their morphology without consequences in their development. And in addition, I assume a developmental trade-off, implying that individuals that are specialized on the resource 6, they are slightly less efficient in feeding upon the zooplankton resource early in life. And although I assume 6 different resources for large individuals, in the cartoons I show I have only 3, because otherwise the pictures are a little bit messy. So this is the ecological model. To study evolution in this model, I make use of the adaptive dynamics framework. And this framework is a framework to study evolution in an ecological context. So you start with the ecological model, and you then actually study phenotypic evolution. So the cost of all this ecological detail that you can put in is that you actually ignore genetic detail and you just study phenotypic evolution. Adaptive dynamics assumes that mutations are very rare and that the effect of each mutation is super small. And therefore, if a mutation is beneficial and it can invade into the population, you assume that the mutation will invade into the population and everyone will get this mutation, and only then the next mutant will arrive. And by assuming this, you actually have a separation of timescales where ecological dynamics are much faster than evolutionary dynamics. And in addition, I assume clonal reproduction. And now you might raise your eyebrows because for speciation to occur, we also need to have reproductive isolating mechanism that prevent gene exchange between the newly arising morphs. And therefore, in addition to the adaptive dynamics approach, I also make use of an individual-based model where reproduction is sexual, and initially reproduction is random. So individuals will choose the partner randomly and not care about that. But it's possible for assortative mating to evolve based on the ecological trait. So when this evolves, it means that individuals prefer to mate with an individual that has the same ecology as they have. But initially this is absent. I will here show you 2 evolutionary time series. On the left, in case of clonal reproduction, and on the right, in case of sexual reproduction. So left is with the adaptive dynamics approach, while right is with the individual-based model. And the vertical axis indicates the traits that are present in the population, where the color of the dots in the right indicates the strength of assortative mating. And in case there's little food available for small individuals, there's no adaptive radiation. Individuals will only specialize on one single resource. And this is the case in both clonal reproduction and sexual reproduction. And the reason that this happens is that when there's little food available for small individuals, competition among them is really strong. And therefore, they grow really slowly because there's little food available. And many individuals actually die before they reach the larger stages where they can start to specialize on the different resources. And because of that, you get a population with many small individuals and relatively few large individuals. And because you have few large individuals, they have lots of food, and there's actually therefore no disruptive selection and therefore no speciation. Vice versa, if there's lots of food for small individuals, the results are different. Again, on the left, clonal reproduction, and on the right, sexual reproduction. Now there's a lot of food for small individuals, and then we do find an adaptive variation. And in case of sexual reproduction, assortative mating is initially not there, so mating is random, but very early on in the adaptive variation, assortative mating becomes very strong, and individuals mate only with morphs that have the same ecology as they have. So you really get 6 different species where there's almost no gene exchange. And the reason that we do get an adaptive variation in this case is that there's lots of food for the small individuals. And therefore they grow really quickly. And this results in a population where you have many big individuals. And because there are so many big individuals, they compete strongly for food. And therefore you get disruptive selection and adaptive variation. It's not only abiotic conditions that determine if you get an adaptive variation or not. It depends a lot on the initial conditions. I will show you on the left an evolutionary time series in case of a population that's initially dominated by many small individuals, and on the right, in case the population is initially dominated by many large individuals and few small individuals. And what you then see is that for the same abiotic conditions, you don't get an adaptive variation in case you have started with many small individuals, but in case you started with many large individuals, you do get an adaptive variation. So it really depends on initial conditions what happens. And the reason that this happens is that there is ecological bistability. So you can either have a population where you have many juveniles. Because you have so many juveniles, competition for food is super strong, and maturation to the larger size classes is therefore very low. Because the inflow to the larger size classes is so limited, you have only a few adults, and competition for the adult resource is therefore extremely low because there are few adults, and therefore they can reproduce a lot, resulting in many juveniles. And again, very strong competition. So it actually reinforces itself. But you can, for the same conditions, have an adult-dominated equilibrium where it's reversed. If you start with many large adults, they compete very strongly for food because there are many individuals, competition is strong. Therefore, they reproduce very little because they need all this food to actually make sure that they don't die. And you get only a few newborn individuals because there are so few individuals there. The competition among them is very. There's almost no competition because there are only a few individuals, and therefore they can grow really quickly and mature quickly into the adult stage. So you get a population with many large individuals and few small individuals, and these. And because in this case, you get adaptive variation because you have so many adults and therefore disruptive selection, while in the other case, there are very few adults and you therefore do not get an adaptive variation. What I want to show here is that the results strongly depend on the body mass at birth. So I will show you 2 parameter plots where the color will indicate the number of species that will evolve. And on the horizontal axis, the body mass at birth. And on the vertical axis, the productivity of the shared resource. And if you remember from what I told you before, when the productivity is low, we don't get an adaptive variation. Well, if it's high, we do find an adaptive variation. And what we see is that again, with high productivity, you get an adaptive variation, but it's much easier when individuals are born with a bigger body mass. And the reason that this is the case is that if they are born larger, they need less food before they can actually transition to the larger size classes where they can specialize on all the available niches there. And therefore, larger body mass at birth promotes adaptive variation. And there is actually some anecdotal evidence for this in the cichlids that I showed you before. Because in cichlids, there is a really strong link between diversification and mouth brooding. So the cichlids that actually diversify and that have this adaptive variation, they are actually all mouth brooders. They produce very big and small, big eggs and only a few. And the larvae are relatively large. So the juvenile period is therefore really, really short. And my model predicts that in those cases, it's relatively more easy to get an adaptive radiation. So a summary of this first part, this competition among small individuals can hinder an adaptive radiation despite plenty of ecological opportunity. In addition, having large eggs or large offspring can promote speciation. And lastly, it's not just, we already know from unstructured models and from what we see in nature that for an adaptive radiation to occur, you need ecological opportunity, and some traits in species can promote these adaptive radiation. But what I show here as well is that the initial condition matter as well. So it's not just abiotic conditions and species, traits in species, but also the initial conditions. In the second part of this talk, I want to show you something about the consequences of this ecological and evolutionary biostability for the stability of a species complex. And in the results I will show you, I only show you ecological dynamics, although, and in case of clonal reproduction, but the results are very similar in case of sexual reproduction, and also if you would allow for evolution, then the results are comparable to what I will show you here. And the main message that I want to tell you is that in cases where we have a species complex where small individuals have a shared resource where they feed upon, those kind of species complex are extremely sensitive to environmental change. And I will give you a few examples. So what I will show you here is an ecological time series with the ecological dynamics on the horizontal axis. And the colored lines that I will show you in a bit will indicate the density of the consumers. And each color stands for a different species. And I will initially keep the supply rate of a focal resource the same as the supply rate of all the other resources. And then after 20 years, I will slowly increase the supply rate of the focal resource. So every year, one species gets a little bit more, there's a little bit more food available for it. And after 75 years, I bring this supply rate back to the original level. And what happens initially, all the species have the same density. If you now increase the food for the focal species, that's the yellow one, the density of the species will increase, while the other species stay more or less constant. And these lines are on top of each other, so it's not so easy to see, but these are 5 species, and only the species number 2 decreases a little bit. Initially, everything increases while the others stay constant, but at a certain point, you reach a tipping point and your 5 species actually go extinct and the other decreases in density. And what's interesting that even if you now bring back the supply rate to the original level, so back to 1, only species number 2 is able to come back, while the other species remain extinct, and allow for migration of individuals of every species. So even if you add some species to the system, they are not able to actually stay there. They will just die. And the conditions are the same as before, where you actually did have 6 species. The reason for this has to do with this ecological and evolutionary bistability. And I will show that by focusing on species number 1, that is the one that got more food. Again, the same ecological time series, where I show here the number of small individuals and the number of large individuals. And after 20 years, we start to increase the food. And what you see is it's because the large individuals, they get more food, they can therefore reproduce more, resulting in more small individuals. And those small individuals, they have enough food available, so they will also mature into adults. So you get an increase in both the small and large individuals. And in the right panel, I show you the density of the shared resource, so the resource that individuals eat when they are small. And you see that this slightly decreases because of the increase in the number of small individuals. But at a certain point, there is a sudden shift. So the equilibrium changes from a state where adults are dominant to a state where juveniles are dominant. And at this point, you have so many small individuals that competition becomes super strong, and most individuals die before they are actually large enough to move to the larger size classes. And you therefore get a bottleneck early on in the life stage and almost no maturation in the larger size classes. So that explains this drop in the larger size classes. But because you have so many larvae and small individuals, they all compete for the shared resource, and the shared resource goes to very low levels. And at this point, actually, the other species go extinct because there's not enough food early in life for them to actually stay in the system. And even if you would bring back the supply rate to the original level, because of the change in the size distribution, the density of the shared resource is too low for the other species to actually invade back in the system. And also, if you would let the population evolve, nothing happens. So you have only 1 or 2 species left. And I will explain it again in with cartoons, because it's, I think, not so easy to understand. So initially, we have a system with many species, and now we increase the food for the blue species, the focal one, because this one has more food. It can reproduce more offspring. So you get more small blue individuals. Because of that, the population of small individuals has increased, and therefore competition for the food individuals have early in life becomes more intense. And therefore, the growth will decrease of those individuals, and the maturation to the larger size classes is reduced. So you get less adults. And there are still a huge inflow of the blue individuals because the large blue adults have plenty of food. And at some point, the competition here is so strong that not a single individual of the other species can actually mature into the larger size classes, and the other species go extinct. And this results is really because of the ontogenetic diet shift. I show you here a 2-parameter plot, and I will talk you through. On the horizontal axis, it's the productivity of the focal resource, and on the vertical axis, the body mass at the ontogenetic diet shift. And in the dashed area, you have bistability with either a system with 6 species or less, that's indicated with the colors. And if you shift your diet at a body mass of 5, for example, and you start with 6 species, if you now increase the productivity of the focal resource, at some point you will actually, this equilibrium with 6 species disappears, and the system collapses to a system with only a single species. So this is the collapse I just showed to you. However, if you have a body, if you shift diet very early in life, directly after birth or very quickly after that, you are always in a state with 6 species. And even if you increase this focal resource, nothing happens. So you don't have this collapse. So it's really a result of this ontogenetic niche shift in the life history of individuals. It's not only a resource for focal species that results in this sudden collapses. Other environmental changes can have similar effects. Here I show you ecological time series in case of a reduction in the food early in life. So initially we have 6 species, and if we now reduce the food available early in life, initially nothing happens. But at this point here, after about 60 years, the system suddenly collapses. Even if you bring back the supply rate to very high levels as before, 4 out of 6 species are not able to reinvade, so they are really extinct. And even if you let them migrate from another habitat, they cannot live here because, again, the size distribution has changed and there's not enough food available for small individuals to survive. And as the last example, here I show you an ecological time series in case of increasing mortality for larger individuals. Again, I start with 6 species, and now I kill large individuals. Initially, not much happens. The system starts to show some population cycles, but at some point, again, the system collapses and you are left with 2 species. And if you stop killing large individuals, those 4 species cannot come back into the system. They are really gone. So these changes are irreversible. To summarize, a species complex with a shared larval diet is super sensitive to environmental change. If you change the environmental conditions, you can lose many species. And even species that were actually not directly affected by the environmental change. So the first example, the blue species got more food. The other species were actually not really affected by that, but they got extinct while the blue species remained in the system. And these collapses are irreversible. Even if you add new individuals, they cannot invade the system. If you let the traits evolve, nothing happens. It's just not possible for the other species to come back. So then I go to my conclusions. Almost all animal species have ontogenetic diet shifts. This is not an exception, it's the rule. And we often tend to ignore that in theoretical models, especially in models that study evolution. Well, I think I showed here that these changes in diet during development can really change the conditions for ecological speciation and also for the persistence of a species complex. And therefore, if we really want to understand biodiversity, the origins, and how we can protect it, it's really essential to take this individual development into account because it really changes what actually the conditions are for speciation and species persistence. And with that, I would like to end the presentation. And thank you a lot for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions.